The 12th day of October in 1944 dawned cold over the waters of the Atlantic coast. A transport vessel named the SS Bremen moved slowly through the harbour entrance at Norfolk, Virginia, her plates showing signs of the long voyage from Europe. Standing along the deck railing were 47 women, all of them German nationals who had been captured in various locations across the crumbling fronts in France and Belgium, along with some pulled from positions inside what remained of the Reich itself. These women wore thin coats that did little against the autumn wind cutting across the water, and they huddled together, whispering among themselves in low voices that carried equal parts anxiety and curiosity. Everything they had been taught, every briefing they had received, every piece of propaganda that had been fed to them through official channels and military instruction had painted a specific picture of America. It was supposed to be a nation of comfort seekers, people who had grown fat and lazy during peacetime, incapable of the kind of discipline and sacrifice that real warfare demanded. The women expected to see a country struggling, perhaps even failing, to meet the demands of global conflict. They anticipated signs of weakness, disorder, and the kind of improvisation that suggested a society stretched beyond its capacity. What greeted their eyes as the gangplank was prepared proved to be something entirely different. The harbour spread before them like a vast metallic landscape, ship after ship after ship extending toward the horizon in rows that seemed to have no end. The noise hit them like a physical force before they even set foot on American soil. Hammers struck steel with such regularity that the sound took on a rhythmic quality, almost musical in its persistence. Somewhere in the middle distance, diesel engines roared to life, belching dark smoke into the grey sky. Cranes towered over the docks like mechanical giants, their cables thick as a man's arm, lifting cargo containers that could have held entire rooms' worth of equipment. The smell that rolled across the water toward them was a mixture of tar, industrial grease, heated metal, and the ever-present salt of the ocean. For women who had spent the last years watching their own country's resources dwindle, watching rations shrink and supplies grow scarce, the sheer abundance of what they were witnessing felt almost obscene. One among their number, a woman who would later be identified in documents as Ingrid, managed to pull a small diary from inside her coat. Her fingers trembled as she wrote, and the words she recorded would survive the war to be studied by historians decades later. She described expecting to find empty spaces, quiet docks, perhaps a few ships scattered here and there. Instead, what she saw reminded her of Hamburg's harbour in the years before the war, back when Germany's merchant fleet had been at its peak, except even that memory paled compared to what stretched before her now. The contradiction between expectation and reality could not have been more stark. These were not ordinary prisoners. Many of them had received technical training, had worked as signals operators, auxiliary personnel, technicians who understood logistics and production capacity. They had learned to read the signs of industrial capability, to estimate output from visible evidence. The Norfolk Naval Yard alone employed more than 40,000 workers at that point in the war, and production records would later show that a Liberty ship was being launched every 4 days. By the time the war ended, American shipyards would have produced 2,710 of these vessels alone, a number that exceeded Germany's entire wartime maritime construction across all categories of ships. A lieutenant from the United States Navy approached the gangplank, his uniform crisp despite the morning chill. His manner was formal but carried none of the hostility the women had steeled themselves to face. He spoke to them through an interpreter, his tone businesslike, almost routine. The women's boots made hollow sounds on the wooden planks as they descended from the ship to the dock. Their eyes moved constantly, darting from one detail to another. American soldiers stood in formation nearby, not menacing but simply present, at ease in a way that suggested this was just another day's work. Behind them, the endless activity of the shipyard continued without pause. Cranes swung their loads, cargo nets bulged with crates, and vessels in various stages of completion sat in their berths like metal skeletons being clothed in steel flesh. The silence among the German women felt heavy. broken only by the shuffle of their feet and the constant industrial percussion that provided a backdrop to everything. For the Americans going about their business, this was entirely normal, just another group of prisoners being processed, just another convoy of ships being built, just another morning in wartime. For the prisoners themselves, each moment brought fresh revelation. Each detail added weight to a growing realization that the world was not as they had been told. They noticed things, small details that accumulated into a larger picture. A line of military trucks sat nearby, engines idling, their fuel tanks obviously full. The tarpaulins covering their cargo beds looked new, unstained by the kind of makeshift repairs that had become common in Germany. Pallets stacked with uniforms rose to waist height, the fabric appearing fresh and unworn. For people who had been living under rationing since 1940, who had grown accustomed to making do with less of everything, these simple observations carried enormous weight. Soap had become precious in the Reich. Sugar was carefully hoarded. Coffee was no longer coffee, but some ersatz substitute made from grains. Yet here, in this enemy country, even the most basic supplies seemed to flow with casual abundance. One woman turned to another and whispered in German, her voice barely audible above the industrial cacophony, that what they were seeing could not possibly be real. Another pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, though whether against the cold or against the implications of what she was witnessing, it was difficult to say. The scene before them had not been staged for their benefit. No one was putting on a show. This was simply the daily reality of American wartime production, and that fact disturbed them more deeply than any carefully orchestrated propaganda display could have. A representative from the Red Cross, present to ensure compliance with international agreements regarding the treatment of prisoners, made notes in a small journal. Later, when these notes were reviewed, they would reveal an interesting observation. The women, this observer wrote, seemed more disoriented by what they were seeing than by the fact of their capture itself. The docks appeared to have communicated something to them that went beyond military strength, something about capacity and will that transcended the mere presence of armed force. As military buses arrived to transport the prisoners inland, the women cast final glances back at the harbour. The forest of masts and smokestacks, the cranes that never seemed to stop moving, the endless stream of workers entering and leaving the yards, all of it seared itself into their memories. But this initial shock was merely the beginning of their education. The journey that lay ahead would take them deeper into the industrial heartland of America, past evidence that would prove even more staggering than what they had witnessed at the docks. With each passing mile, the gap between what they had been taught to believe and what they were now seeing with their own eyes would widen until it became a chasm too wide to bridge with denial. The convoy of vehicles departed Norfolk shortly after midday, flanked by a pair of military jeeps that maintained a respectful distance but made clear that this was an official movement of prisoners under guard. The buses themselves wore the standard olive paint of military vehicles, their windows still streaked with dried salt spray from the coastal air. Inside, the German women sat rigid in their seats, maintaining the kind of silence that comes from shock rather than discipline. Their eyes remained fixed on the passing landscape, unable to look away despite the growing weight of what they were seeing. They had braced themselves for scarcity, for the kind of stripped-down, desperate efficiency that comes when a nation throws everything into a war effort at the expense of civilian comfort. Instead, mile after mile revealed something that seemed impossible. The shipyards did not end when they left Norfolk proper. They extended for blocks in every direction, smoke and steam rising from construction gantries in columns that merged with the clouds. Welders sent fountains of sparks cascading down from scaffolding, each bright shower representing another section of hull plate being joined, another vessel growing closer to completion. Liberty ships in various stages of assembly stood like buildings under construction, some nothing more than skeletal frameworks of ribs and keel, others nearly ready for their maiden voyage with only final fittings remaining. Among the prisoners sat a young woman who had served as a signals officer before her capture. She had studied naval tonnage tables as part of her training, had memorized the production capacity of various shipyards across Europe. Now she stared at the American yards sliding past the bus windows and did some quick mental calculations. The whisper that escaped her lips carried disbelief that bordered on denial. 1 yard here, she murmured to the woman beside her, seemed to be producing more hulls than the entire facility at Kiel. The numbers, when later checked against production records, would prove her estimate conservative. Norfolk alone was responsible for dozens of destroyers, aircraft carriers, and auxiliary vessels by this point in the war. Across the entire United States, shipyards were producing 18 million tons of shipping annually, a figure that represented 6 times Germany's total wartime output across all its yards combined. The rhythm of industrial work followed them as the buses moved on. Hammers and rivet guns created a percussion that seemed to pulse in time with some vast heartbeat, as if the entire landscape had become a living organism dedicated to the production of war material. As the convoy left the immediate coastal area and pushed inland, the character of what they saw evolved but did not diminish. Smokestacks punctuated the horizon in every direction. Warehouses sprawled across acres of land, their walls marked with names that the women recognized vaguely from intelligence briefings and intercepted documents. Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. These were companies whose capacity German analysts had tried to estimate, usually settling on figures that now seemed laughably low. One prisoner would later recall, in an interview conducted years after the war, that it felt as though every town had been transformed into a barracks, every street into a supply line. The realization hit them, she said, that their own newspapers had been feeding them lies. This was not a soft people, not a distracted or divided society. This was a nation that had organized itself for war with the same efficiency they had been told was uniquely German, except the scale was beyond anything the Reich had achieved. The roads themselves became part of the revelation. Highways carried steady streams of trucks, each one loaded with crates or weapons or spare parts or any of 1,000 other items necessary to keep armies supplied across 2 oceans. Gasoline, which had become so precious in Germany that doctors had taken to riding bicycles to make house calls, flowed freely here. The women could smell it when the convoy slowed down, that sharp, sweet scent of petroleum products that had become rare back home. One of the drivers, a sergeant named James Foster, according to later records, overheard one of the prisoners gasp when they passed a depot where hundreds of trucks sat lined up nose to tail, waiting to be dispatched. He chuckled quietly to himself and muttered under his breath that what she was seeing represented maybe half of what was on the road at any given time. For him, this was utterly mundane. For the prisoners, it was impossible to reconcile with what they thought they knew about American capacity. At a rest stop outside Newport News, the buses pulled over beside a rail yard. The prisoners were allowed a brief period to stretch their legs under the watchful eyes of their guards, but most of them remained at the windows, transfixed by what they were seeing. Long lines of railroad cars stretched into the distance, boxcars and flatbeds, each one marked with white chalk indicating its destination. Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis. Names that represented cities thousands of miles away, yet the logistics appeared seamless. Cranes loaded crates marked with serial numbers and military designations. The orderliness of the operation struck the women as almost more impressive than the volume. Back in the Reich, chaos had become the norm. Allied bombing raids disrupted shipment schedules constantly. Shortages forced improvisation. Rail lines were damaged faster than they could be repaired. Here, everything moved with machine-like precision, each element fitting into a larger pattern that suggested planning and resources that dwarfed what Germany could manage. The prisoners began to exchange glances, making silent calculations. Several of them were trained analysts whose value to Berlin had rested on their ability to assess industrial capacity from observable evidence. What they were seeing now, the frequency of rail traffic, the volume of material being moved, the systematic stockpiling of goods, All pointed to an enemy whose resource base was not just larger, but fundamentally different in character. One woman managed to scribble notes in a small book she had concealed in her coat. These notes would later be recovered and preserved. She wrote that they had been taught America was a land of consumers, people who bought and used, but did not truly produce. What she was seeing proved the opposite. This was a land of producers, she wrote, and every factory they passed felt like another nail being driven into the coffin of German hopes. The paradox deepened with every observation. No one was making a show of this abundance. No officials stood by explaining how impressive it all was. American civilians along the route simply went about their business. Workers in coveralls walked to and from factories. Children played in yards beside the road. Women carried grocery bags that appeared genuinely full. There was no sense of the kind of exhaustion that had settled over German cities, no hollow-eyed starvation, no visible strain. Instead, a kind of vitality seemed to radiate from everything, from the well-maintained roads to the solid-looking houses to the casual way people moved about their daily tasks. The prisoners struggled to process what this meant. Here was a nation waging war across the entire globe, fighting in Europe and the Pacific simultaneously, supplying allies, building ships and planes and weapons at a rate that seemed to defy reason, and yet civilian life continued with what appeared to be relative comfort. People were still being fed properly. They were still being clothed in decent fabric. Infrastructure was still being maintained and even expanded. The contrast with conditions in Germany, where everything had been sacrificed to the war effort, and still it was not enough, could not have been more pronounced. By the time the convoy approached Richmond as the afternoon light began to fade, the women had fallen into a silence that felt different from the tense quiet of the morning. The initial shock of Norfolk Harbour had given way to something deeper and more disturbing. What they had witnessed in the space of a single afternoon exceeded what Germany could produce in a year, perhaps longer. Their faith in the propaganda that had sustained them, the assurances that America was soft and incapable and divided, was dissolving like morning frost under the Virginia sun. But their education was far from complete. The camps that awaited them would present yet another paradox, one that would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of the society that had captured them and the one they had served. The buses turned off the main highway as dusk settled over the landscape, tires crunching on gravel as they approached a sprawling compound enclosed by barbed wire fencing. The women braced themselves internally, each one calling up images shaped by propaganda and military briefings. They expected filth. They expected overcrowding, they expected brutality as a matter of course. German media had portrayed American prisoner camps as barely better than animal pens, places where captives were kept in degrading conditions with minimal food and no regard for human dignity. Yet as the gates swung open and the compound came into view, another contradiction presented itself, one that might have been even more disturbing than the industrial capacity they had witnessed earlier. The barracks that spread before them looked nothing like prison facilities. If anything, they resembled the sort of campus one might find at a small college, with neat rows of wooden buildings arranged in orderly lines. The roofs had been properly tarred against weather. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the scent that drifted across the compound was unmistakable. Fresh bread baking in what must have been a nearby kitchen facility. Beyond the barracks, they could see tidy garden plots and an open field marked out for recreation. One of the women, a nurse named Hildegard, who had served in a field hospital before her capture, let out a sound that was almost a laugh, except it carried no humour. Her voice was flat with disbelief as she muttered that the prisoners here seemed to live better than German soldiers at the front. The processing centre revealed more surprises. Each woman was assigned an identification number, photographed with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested well-established procedures and issued clean bedding. The medical inspection that followed was conducted by a Navy physician named Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, whose manner was brisk and professional without being cold. She examined each prisoner methodically, checking teeth, listening to lungs, making notes on charts. At one point, speaking through an interpreter, she commented that nearly every one of them showed signs of malnutrition. "You have been subsisting on perhaps 1,200 calories per day," she said. "Maybe even less than that. Our men receive twice that amount even when they are in the field." For the German women, the contrast felt humiliating precisely because it was delivered without malice, simply stated as medical fact. Back home, rations had been shrinking for years. Black bread came in thin slices. Coffee was no longer coffee, but some substitute made from roasted grains that tasted like coloured water. Stews had become little more than thin broths with occasional vegetables. Here, even prisoners of war were being measured for properly fitting shoes and vaccinated against disease as a matter of routine. Ingrid, writing in her journal that evening, tried to capture the conflicting emotions. "They treat us like patients rather than enemies," she wrote. "It is simultaneously an insult and a mercy, and I do not know how to feel about that." The contradictions did not stop with medical care and adequate housing. That evening, as the women were led to their assigned barracks, they found clean cots waiting for them, each one fitted with wool blankets that were far better than anything they had seen in months. Soap and towels had been stacked in neat piles near the washroom facilities. A representative from the Red Cross explained, in careful German, that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to certain basic standards of treatment. The women listened in a kind of stunned silence. Their own government had been signatory to those same conventions, yet Soviet prisoners in German camps were often left to starve in open fields. French captives had fared little better. The differential treatment was impossible to ignore. Statistics would later bear out the vast gulf in how prisoners were treated by different sides in the war. In American camps, German POWs received an average of 3,500 calories daily, more than many American civilians were getting under wartime rationing. In German camps, Allied prisoners frequently subsisted on fewer than 1,000 calories, sometimes far less. The numbers were stark, and the evidence was written on the bodies and faces of prisoners on both sides. One of the German women confessed in a hushed whisper to her neighbour that if Berlin knew the truth of how well they were surviving, there would be no forgiveness, no understanding. The mere fact of their adequate treatment might be seen as collaboration. The sensory details of that first evening in the camp carved themselves into memory with the kind of clarity that trauma or profound surprise can create. The smell of clean sheets, something most of them had not experienced in over a year. The taste of white bread and real butter at the evening meal, luxuries that had vanished from German tables years ago. The clatter of stainless steel cutlery instead of the wooden or tin implements they had grown accustomed to. All of it represented a level of plenty that seemed divorced from the reality of wartime sacrifice. In one corner of the dining hall, a prisoner broke down in tears after biting into an orange. She held the fruit in both hands as though it were something precious and fragile, which in her experience it had become. "To us," she whispered between sobs, "this is luxury beyond any reasonable expectation." Her companions understood completely. Citrus fruits had become memories in Germany, things from before the war, items that appeared in children's stories but not on actual tables. Yet the treatment extended to them was not indulgence or kindness in any simple sense. It was discipline, systematic and planned. Guards maintained order firmly. Rules were enforced. Escape attempts, though rare, were not tolerated. But the baseline civility itself functioned as a kind of weapon, a demonstration of American confidence that carried its own message. One US officer was later quoted as remarking that they could afford to treat prisoners well precisely because they were not afraid of them, not concerned that decent treatment would somehow strengthen the enemy cause. The comment revealed a mindset utterly foreign to the German military tradition, where harshness was often seen as necessary to maintain dominance. The women lay in their bunks that first night, listening to the low mechanical hum of a generator somewhere in the compound and the occasional bark of guard dogs in the distance. For some, it was the first night of uninterrupted sleep they had experienced in months. For others, the rest was troubled by dreams and uncomfortable thoughts. Being shown humanity by the enemy made it harder to justify the brutality of their own side. The cognitive dissonance was painful. They had been raised on stories of German superiority, German efficiency, German discipline. Yet here they were being treated with a systematic decency that their own government did not extend to those it had captured. But what they had witnessed thus far, the overwhelming industrial production, the well-maintained infrastructure, the comfortable prisoner facilities, represented only the surface layer of American power. In the days ahead, they would hear and see things that would deepen their understanding even further. The reach of American communications, the coordination of war efforts across vast distances, would soon become apparent in ways that made the scale of the conflict impossible to ignore. The morning routine established itself quickly. A bugle call pierced the dawn, sharp and clear in the autumn air. After breakfast, which consisted of eggs, toast and coffee that tasted like actual coffee rather than the grain substitutes they had grown accustomed to, the prisoners were escorted into a common hall that served multiple purposes. Here, for the first time since their capture, they encountered something that challenged their understanding as profoundly as the shipyards had. They heard the open flow of American communications, unrestricted and apparently unguarded in ways that seemed impossible to women who had been trained in signal work. Radios hummed with static and voices. Telephones rang with steady frequency. The clatter of typewriters created a background rhythm. For prisoners who had served as radar operators, signals analysts, and communications technicians, the soundscape itself conveyed information. They leaned forward unconsciously, ears sharpened by training, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. Through the hiss and crackle of shortwave sets came voices speaking English in various accents and cadences. Weather updates from somewhere in Kansas. Shipping manifests being read from New Orleans. Naval traffic reports from positions off the Pacific coast. The breadth of information being transmitted was staggering enough, but what truly shocked them was how unencrypted much of it seemed, how openly it flowed. One of the prisoners, Lotta, the former radio operator whose sharp ears had made her valuable to German military intelligence, whispered her observation to the woman beside her. "They do not even attempt to hide it," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and fear. "They broadcast to the entire world because they possess the confidence and capacity to do so." Back in the Reich, secrecy had been elevated to the status of religion. Every transmission was coded. Every line was assumed to be monitored. Paranoia governed every communication, from the highest military channels down to routine administrative messages. Here, the openness felt almost aggressive in its casualness. A U.S. Army sergeant who had been assigned to oversee the common hall noticed the prisoners' intense attention. He wandered over, not hostile, but curious about what had captured their interest so thoroughly. When the interpreter explained, he shrugged as though discussing nothing more remarkable than the weather. "This is just normal operations," he said. "We have got thousands of stations, thousands of telephone lines, every state, every military base, every ship at sea. We are all connected in a network that spans the continent and reaches across both oceans." He delivered this information as simple fact, without any sense that he was revealing something impressive or significant. But for the prisoners, the implications were staggering. Germany's communication networks, already fragmented before the war, had been progressively crippled by Allied bombing campaigns. Shortages of copper wire and switching equipment meant that even maintaining existing lines was a struggle. The network was shrinking even as the demands on it grew. Here, the suggestion was that communications infrastructure extended across continental distances with apparent ease, coordinating a war effort that spanned the globe. Numbers would later confirm what the women were beginning to understand through observation and casual conversation with their captors. By 1944, the United States military alone operated over 400,000 telephone lines dedicated to military communications. Civilian telephone networks numbered in the tens of millions of functioning connections. In contrast, Germany had fewer than 2 million telephone lines still operational, and many of those were concentrated in cities that had already been reduced to rubble by bombing. The differential was not just quantitative but qualitative, representing a fundamental difference in infrastructure and organizational capacity. The prisoners were even allowed to send letters home under supervision of the Red Cross. Some dictated messages to clerks who typed them on clean paper with proper letterhead. The act of touching a telephone, of watching a letter being prepared for international delivery with the assumption it would actually arrive, felt to them like reconnecting with civilization. Ingrid recorded her thoughts about this later. To see communication handled with such ease, she wrote, to witness letters carried freely across thousands of miles, was to feel that we had been returned to a world we thought had vanished. Yet this freedom, this efficiency, was precisely what we had been taught to despise as decadent and weak. The paradox cut deeper with each passing hour. The generosity of their captors, the systematic efficiency, the casual abundance, all of it served to highlight by contrast the bankruptcy of promises made by their own regime. The sensory experience reinforced every observation. The steady electric buzz of switchboards operating in the background, the metallic snap of plugs being inserted into connection points, the constant whir of teletype machines feeding paper through their mechanisms. Together they created a symphony of coordination, a reminder that modern warfare was not fought solely with bullets and bombs, but with information flowing across vast distances. Hildegard, the nurse who had initially expressed disbelief at the prisoner camp conditions, found herself reflecting on larger implications. In a post-war interview conducted years later, she would recall her thoughts from those days. "I had believed with complete certainty that America was disorganized," she said, "lazy and without the discipline necessary for real warfare. Instead, I discovered that even their voices possessed order. The war lived in every telephone line, every radio frequency, every wire carrying signals across the continent. It was inescapable and overwhelming. But what struck the prisoners most forcefully was the realization that the Americans were not staging any of this for their benefit. They were not being given a tour designed to impress or intimidate. This was simply routine administration, the background noise of a functioning military operating on a scale that Germany had never achieved and now never would. If this represented the casual everyday operations of a single prisoner facility in Virginia, what must the full scope of American communications sound like? How vast must the network be if even this small slice of it carried such volume and complexity? That evening, as the women returned to their barracks under guard, the weight of what they had witnessed sat heavily on all of them. They had been soldiers, trained to fight and, if necessary, die for their country. They had expected upon capture to face humiliation, deprivation, perhaps violence. Instead, they were being granted glimpses into a system so vast and well organized that it appeared casual in its exercise of power. For the Reich, secrecy had been armor, necessary protection for a nation whose resources were limited and whose vulnerabilities had to be hidden. For America, transparency seemed to function as a demonstration of strength, a message that they had nothing to hide because there was nothing that could threaten their capacity. Soon, another layer of that capacity would be revealed to them. Their next excursion would take them into aircraft hangars where American air power would be made manifest not through statistics or briefings, but through the immediate physical presence of steel wings and thundering engines, proof that the war in the skies above Europe was being waged by a nation whose production capacity seemed limitless. The smell hit them first, even before the hangar doors came fully into view. It was a thick industrial scent that seemed to have weight and texture, heavy with petroleum products, rubber compounds, and the metallic tang of fresh engine oil. The odour clung to clothing and hair long after leaving the facility, a sensory memory that would prove as indelible as any of the visual impressions they would gather. The convoy of buses pulled to a stop beside an enormous corrugated metal building. Its doors rolled back to reveal an interior that seemed to swallow light. Inside that vast space, aircraft wings gleamed under banks of overhead lamps. Engines hung suspended from cranes, their complex innards exposed like mechanical anatomy. Teams of workers swarmed over fuselages with practiced coordination, each person knowing their role in a larger choreography of assembly. For German women who had been raised on tales of Luftwaffe supremacy, who had been told that German engineering and German aircraft represented the pinnacle of aviation technology, the scene before them carried profound psychological weight. In their minds, Messerschmitts and Junkers and Focke-Wulfs were still the finest fighting machines in the sky. Yet here stood rows of American bombers and fighters, not hidden away in precious secrecy as Germany's dwindling air force had to be, but displayed in what could only be called profusion. Dozens upon dozens of aircraft in various stages of completion, perhaps even hundreds depending on how one counted the sub-assemblies and component parts waiting to be integrated. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien had been assigned to escort duty. He was a cheerful man of Irish extraction, his sleeves permanently stained with grease that no amount of washing could fully remove. He walked the prisoners down the length of the hangar floor with the unself-conscious ease of someone who saw nothing remarkable in what surrounded them. At one point he stopped beside a B-24 Liberator, slapping the metal flank of the bomber with casual familiarity. "This beauty right here," he said through the interpreter, speaking loudly to be heard over the background noise, "can be completely replaced in 3 days if she gets shot down. 3 days, ladies. That is how quickly we can turn out a new one to take her place." The words landed among the prisoners with more impact than any bomb could have delivered. 3 days. Back in Germany, aircraft factories were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing raids. Spare parts had become precious commodities, hoarded and carefully allocated. Engines took weeks to properly assemble when components were available at all. Some planes were being cannibalized, stripped of functional parts to keep other aircraft flying. The idea that a lost bomber represented nothing more than a line item on a production schedule, something to be filled as routinely as ordering office supplies, was almost impossible to process. O'Brien's casual boast was supported by production figures that would later be declassified and analysed by historians. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft of all types. This represented more than Germany had built during the entire war from its beginning to that point. At peak production, a new airplane was rolling off American assembly lines every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day. The scale was not just impressive, it was overwhelming to the point of seeming fictional. The sensory environment of the hangar made denial impossible. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns echoed through the cavernous space like automatic weapons fire, except instead of destruction, each burst created structure, joining metal to metal with permanent bonds. The air shimmered with heat radiating from arc welders, their brilliant flares forcing the women to look away or risk damaging their eyes. Workers shouted to each other over the roar of engines being test-fired, their voices carrying the particular kind of easy profanity that comes from men engaged in difficult physical labour who are confident in their skills. The floor itself seemed to vibrate with the cumulative energy of all this activity, as though the building had become a living thing whose only purpose was the production of aircraft. Lotta, the radio operator who had proven most adept at reading significance into what she observed, found herself muttering almost unconsciously. "So many machines," she said to no one in particular, "and still more coming." Her voice trembled, not from any fear of the guards or concern for her own safety, but from the sheer weight of realization pressing down on her. Hildegard, the nurse, would later confess in her personal journal that the revelation struck her with particular force. "Our leaders told us that America was weak," she wrote, "that Americans were unwilling to make real sacrifices. Yet here, sacrifice itself had become invisible because it was distributed so widely. This was not desperation. This was production at a scale that made desperation unnecessary. What disturbed the prisoners, perhaps most of all, was the casualness of it all. The workers were not grim-faced soldiers driven by ideology or fear. They joked with each other during brief breaks. They shared cigarettes. They wiped sweat from their brows and stretched sore muscles with the kind of body language that suggested hard work but not suffering. For German women who had been told that every German worker was operating at maximum capacity, pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, this apparent ease felt wrong somehow. How could a people so relaxed, so seemingly unburdened, produce such overwhelming force? O'Brien noticed their expressions and misread the silence as simple awe. He leaned closer to the interpreter and spoke in a conspiratorial tone that was nevertheless loud enough for several of the prisoners to hear. "You think this facility is impressive," he said with a grin that was not unkind. "You should see what they are doing in Detroit. This whole operation here is nothing compared to the automobile factories they converted. This is just a drop in the bucket, as we say." He chuckled and moved on, leaving the women standing in silence. The paradox hung in the air like the smell of engine oil, impossible to ignore or explain away. For Germany, every aircraft lost was a tragedy, a blow to diminishing air power that could not be easily recovered. For America, a lost plane was an inconvenience, something noted in a ledger and corrected through the simple expedient of building another one faster than the enemy could destroy them. That difference alone told the story of how the war would end, if only someone had been willing to read the signs clearly. As the women were herded back toward the waiting buses, the sound of an engine test firing shook the ground beneath their feet. The roar was physical, something felt in the chest cavity and bones, not merely heard with the ears. That sound followed them out into the sunlight and stayed with them as they climbed back into the vehicles, a vibration that seemed to settle into their very marrow like a prophecy of what was coming for their homeland. But the education they were receiving had not yet reached its conclusion. In the weeks that would follow, they would be shown something harder to deny even than the physical evidence of industrial capacity they had witnessed thus far. They would see photographs and intelligence reports that documented American bombing campaigns, proof that all this productive power was not merely theoretical, but was reaching deep into the heart of the Reich with devastating precision. 3 weeks passed in the rhythms of camp life, a strange kind of limbo where time felt both suspended and relentless. The prisoners settled into routines that began to feel almost normal. Meals arrived regularly, more food than they had seen in years. Medical checkups became routine rather than occasions for anxiety. The recreation periods allowed for carefully monitored movement and even some conversation among prisoners from different groups. But the moment that would alter their understanding most profoundly came not from direct observation, but from what American intelligence officers chose to show them on paper. One morning they were gathered in a small hall normally used for educational lectures or briefings. Long wooden tables had been arranged in rows, and on these tables lay spread dozens of photographs. The images were black and white, the kind of aerial reconnaissance shots that military analysts studied constantly, but their content was devastating in its clarity. The photographs showed German cities from high altitude, industrial complexes before and after bombing raids, transportation networks reduced to tangled wreckage, synthetic fuel production facilities cracked open like eggs with their vital machinery exposed to the sky. One officer, speaking in measured tones through an interpreter, tapped a photograph showing what had once been the Leuna Works near Merseburg. This facility, he explained without particular emphasis, produced the majority of Germany's aviation fuel. Or rather, it produced aviation fuel in the past tense. The image next to the one he indicated showed the same location transformed into a landscape of twisted steel, shattered pipelines, and frozen plumes of smoke captured mid-rise by the camera. The women leaned over the photographs, their silence heavy with recognition. They had been told by broadcasts from Berlin that Allied bombing was ineffective, that it represented nothing more than random terror attacks that destroyed civilian housing while leaving German war production intact. Yet here was evidence of something entirely different, something precise and calculated and utterly relentless. Image after image reinforced the point until it became inescapable. a ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to geometric patterns of rubble. Bridges spanning the Rhine broken like children's toys, their massive stone piers still standing, but the connecting spans gone, dropped into the river below. Rail yards in Cologne transformed into fields of craters, the tracks bent into useless sculptures of twisted metal. One prisoner, a woman named Marta, who had rarely spoken since her capture, found herself whispering almost unconsciously. "So that is why the trains never arrive anymore." The observation was simple, almost childlike, but it connected abstract strategic planning with the concrete experience of life in Germany, where reliable transportation had become a memory. Statistics backed up what the photographs showed with pitiless clarity. By mid-1944, Allied bombing forces were dropping more than 200,000 tons of explosives on German targets every single month. Aircraft losses were significant, sometimes horrifically high on individual missions, but American production capacity, those endless hangars full of bombers being assembled in 3-day cycles, made the losses sustainable. Germany, meanwhile, could not replace what was being destroyed. Every factory blown open, every fuel depot set ablaze, every bridge dropped into a river represented capacity that could not be recovered. Each photograph laid bare a truth that propaganda could not obscure. The Reich was bleeding out under skies it no longer controlled. The sensory impact of the photographs was undeniable, even though they were static images. The women found themselves studying the jagged white scars of bomb craters against blackened earth, the skeletal remains of industrial buildings that had once buzzed with machinery and workers, the neat rows of destroyed rail cars that would never carry cargo again. One prisoner wrote in her diary that evening, describing how she could almost smell the smoke rising from the paper itself, could almost hear the whistle of falling bombs frozen in the moment before impact. What shook them perhaps more than the content of the photographs was the manner in which the American officers presented them. This was not theatre designed for psychological effect. This was not propaganda meant to break their spirits. This was routine intelligence analysis, the kind of thing these officers sifted through every single day as part of their regular duties. To the prisoners, each photograph represented a wound to their homeland, evidence of loss and destruction that was almost too painful to acknowledge. To the officers, these were just reports in a stack of thousands, data points in a larger strategic picture. One officer explained the methodology with the kind of clinical detachment that made the information even harder to bear. "We have learned," he said, "that we do not need to destroy everything. We only need to eliminate specific categories of targets. Fuel production facilities, ball-bearing manufacturers, transportation choke points. When those are removed from the equation, your armies cannot maneuver effectively regardless of how many soldiers or tanks remain nominally intact." His words were analytical rather than cruel, but to the prisoners they carried the weight of mathematical inevitability. Ingrid captured the essence of this realization in her journal entry that night. "What defeated us," she wrote in careful script, "was not hatred or ideology or even superior courage. It was arithmetic. They simply calculated what needed to be destroyed and then destroyed it with industrial efficiency. We were fighting an emotional war while they were solving an equation. The paradox that had been building through every stage of their experience in America reached a kind of crescendo in that room full of photographs. German propaganda had painted Americans as reckless and chaotic, as people whose abundance had made them soft and whose democracy had made them weak. What the prisoners were confronting instead was evidence of cold, disciplined precision married to overwhelming productive capacity. The Americans were not winning through barbarism, but through systematic application of resources to carefully chosen objectives. When the briefing session ended, the women walked back to their barracks under a sky streaked with high-altitude contrails. For the first time, they looked up at those white lines scratching across the blue expanse and felt as though the very sky belonged to the enemy. The Reich had promised them that German technology and German will would ensure control of the air. The truth was written in vapor trails above their heads and in the photographs they had just seen. American aircraft flew where they wished, bombed what they chose, and returned to bases where replacement bombers waited if any were lost. But this accumulating knowledge created a profound dilemma for the prisoners. They possessed information that contradicted everything their countrymen back home were being told. Should they remain silent, protecting themselves from accusations of defeatism or collaboration? Or should they speak truth, risking being labelled traitors for acknowledging reality? That question would soon be brought into sharp focus by the arrival of a smuggled letter, one that would force them to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. The letter appeared on a grey afternoon, slipped beneath the door of one of the barracks like contraband. Hildegard discovered it first, the nurse whose initial disbelief at camp conditions had gradually transformed into a more complex understanding. She picked up the envelope carefully, turning it over in her hands as though it might be dangerous. There was no official marking, no postage, only faint pencil markings that might have been routing codes from some informal prisoner network. When she carefully unfolded the paper inside, the other women gathered around her like moths drawn to flame, crowding close to read over her shoulder. The message was brief, written in hurried German script that suggested it had been composed quickly, perhaps under conditions where discovery might have brought punishment. "Hold fast," the letter urged. "The Reich is pushing back on all fronts. New weapons are being deployed that will change the character of the war. Do not believe what the Americans show you. Final victory remains within reach if we maintain our faith and our will." The words echoed precisely the kind of rhetoric the women had been hearing before their capture, promises that felt increasingly hollow with each passing month of the war. The letter's tone carried notes of desperation that were louder than its stated message of confidence. Lotta, the sharp-eared radio operator, was first to voice what several of them were thinking. "If we were truly winning," she said quietly, "they would not need to smuggle messages urging us to hold fast. Winners do not need to beg for continued belief." But Hildegard pressed the paper flat against the wooden table, her expression troubled. "Still," she said, "this reflects what our families are being told back home. What if they believe these promises while we sit here knowing something entirely different?" The tension in the barracks thickened as the implications sank in. Their lives in the camp had become shaped by layers of contradiction. They were being treated better by their enemies than their own government had treated those it captured. They were being fed properly while they knew their families went hungry. They were being shown truths that directly contradicted official German narratives. Now this letter threatened to pull them back into the shadows of belief they had been emerging from, or at minimum forced them to confront the gap between what they knew and what those they loved still believed. That evening, an American lieutenant appeared at the barracks, the same officer who had conducted the briefing with the aerial photographs. He held the intercepted letter in his hand, making no pretense that private communications were truly private in a prisoner camp. His German was halting but comprehensible, marked by an American accent that flattened some vowels and hardened others. "You are under no obligation to believe me," he said, choosing his words with care. "But you should understand that we have no need to show you fabrications. We do not require lies when truth serves our purposes better." He then laid out a fresh set of photographs on the communal table, images even more recent than those they had seen before. Frankfurt rail depots reduced to fields of rubble, columns of smoke rising from Hamburg that seemed to reach into the stratosphere itself, so tall and dense they appeared almost solid in the frozen instant of the photograph. The contrast between the smuggled letter's promises and the stark visual evidence could not have been more pronounced. Words on paper versus physical reality documented from the air. For the first time since her capture, a prisoner named Greta, who had maintained almost complete silence for weeks, spoke up firmly. Her voice cut through the uneasy quiet of the barracks. "If Germany possesses such wonderful new weapons as the letter claims," she asked with an edge that might have been anger or despair, "why do they not stop this?" She tapped one finger against a photograph showing smoke rising from what had been an industrial complex. Why does the destruction continue and even accelerate if we have the means to prevent it? The silence that followed her question felt heavier than any guard's command could have imposed. It was the silence of women confronting thoughts they had been avoiding, questions they had not wanted to ask themselves. The letter had been intended to shore up their faith, to remind them of their duty to the Reich. Instead, it had crystallized the contradictions they had been living with, forcing them to choose between comfortable denial and painful acknowledgement. That night, sleep came poorly to most of them. The sound of aircraft engines from a training field several miles distant rolled through the darkness like distant thunder, a reminder that never quite ceased. Their dreams, when they came, were confused tangles of images. Factories collapsing in slow motion. Trains that never arrived at their destinations. The faces of family members they feared they might never see again. And underneath it all, the nagging, persistent thought that perhaps loyalty had become nothing more than a habit of fear. Something they clung to, not because it made sense, but because abandoning it meant acknowledging they had been wrong about things too fundamental to question. The letter had been meant to strengthen their resolve. Instead, it had acted like a crack in a dam, allowing doubts to flood through with greater force. The question of what to believe no longer admitted of easy answers. In the weeks ahead, as their American guards began permitting carefully controlled visits to nearby towns under escort, the contrast between propaganda and reality would deepen further until denial became not just difficult but actively exhausting. Spring arrived in Virginia with the kind of warmth that promises renewal, but in the prisoner camp it brought instead a strange quieting, a settling of expectations. Newspapers appeared in the common rooms with increasing frequency, left there quite deliberately by American officers. The headlines announced the fall of German cities in a steady drumbeat of bad news. Cologne had fallen. Dresden had been bombed into a state that defied description. Frankfurt had been captured. Each city name represented not just a military defeat, but the crumbling of a world the prisoners had been taught to believe was permanent. By April, the whispers reached even the German women confined in their Virginia camp. The Führer, the leader they had been taught to see as somehow beyond ordinary human limitations, was dead. The Reich that had proclaimed it would endure for 1,000 years had lasted barely 12 before collapsing in fire and rubble and blood. The women sat on their wooden bunks, looking at each other across gaps that no words could easily bridge, trying to reconcile the world they had been raised to believe in with the world that was now revealing itself in all its brutal reality. Ingrid wrote in her diary during those final weeks before repatriation, her handwriting showing the kind of careful control that comes from strong emotion held rigidly in check. "We came to this place as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to rule Europe," she recorded. "We were told we represented the future, that our cause was just and our victory inevitable. Now I see with painful clarity that we were children being fed stories while America was constructing a world beyond anything our leaders had imagined or could match." The United States Army began preparations for returning the prisoners to Germany. They were issued clean uniforms to replace the worn clothing they had arrived in. Medical examinations ensured they were fit to travel. Rations were provided for the ocean voyage, quantities of food that would have seemed generous even in peacetime. Some of the women wept at the thought of seeing family again after so long, assuming their families had survived. Others felt a kind of dread at returning to a defeated, starving Germany after months of adequate food and decent treatment. For all of them, the journey carried a paradox they could not escape. They were leaving behind comfort and order in the land that had been their enemy, returning to chaos and hunger in the land they called home. Before departure, a Red Cross officer approached Ingrid with what was described as a request, but felt more like an assignment. She was asked if she would be willing to carry a message back to Germany, not a personal letter, but an official report to whatever remained of German military authority. The decision had apparently been debated in Washington. Would her words be dismissed immediately as enemy propaganda, or might they serve some useful purpose in demonstrating the futility of continued resistance? The war in Europe was essentially over, But there were still those who spoke of fighting on, of Alpine redoubts and last stands. Perhaps testimony from prisoners who had seen American capacity firsthand might help end that dangerous foolishness. Ingrid's report was brief, almost blunt in its directness. America's industrial strength is not fabrication or exaggeration, she wrote. It is everywhere, manifest in their machinery, their factories, their food supplies, their communications networks, their unity of purpose. To imagine that further resistance would achieve anything except additional needless death is not courage, but madness. The words were harsh, deliberately so, because anything softer might be dismissed as sentiment rather than analysis. When the ship carrying the repatriated prisoners docked in Bremerhaven, the Germany they found bore little resemblance to the country they had left. Cities were rubble. Food was scarce. The social order had collapsed into desperate improvisation. Ingrid's report was dutifully forwarded up what remained of the chain of command. The reaction from those few officers still clinging to authority was entirely predictable. Some labelled her a traitor, a woman whose spirit had been broken by captivity. Others suggested more charitably that she had simply been deceived by clever American propaganda, shown false evidence and fed lies that she had mistakenly taken for truth. The idea that her observations might be accurate was too threatening to accept. Acknowledging the scale of American power meant acknowledging that the war had been lost before it truly began, that all the sacrifice and death had been for nothing. But for the women themselves, what they carried back to Germany could not be erased by official denials or ideological gymnastics. They had seen too much. The image of aircraft rolling off assembly lines at rates that exceeded German monthly production, the memory of meals more abundant than their families had seen in years. The sound of communications networks coordinating across continental distances. The casual efficiency with which American workers had approached tasks that would have required desperate effort in Germany. Most of all, they remembered the photographs of their homeland being systematically dismantled from the air, proof that the American industrial capacity they had witnessed was not theoretical, but actively devastating. Years later, some of them would share these memories with children and grandchildren who had grown up in the ruins and reconstruction of post-war Germany. They spoke not of humiliation, though capture is never pleasant, but of a kind of awakening. They recalled the sound of hammers on steel in Norfolk Harbour, rhythmic and relentless as a heartbeat. They remembered endless rows of ships and tanks and aircraft that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. They described the casual freedom of speech they had overheard in American streets and cafes, the way people discussed and even criticized their government without fear of midnight arrests. These were not abstractions from books or propaganda films. These were lived experiences, sensory memories that photographs and statistics could not capture. The women had arrived in America as prisoners of a regime that had called itself invincible, had proclaimed racial and cultural superiority, had promised dominance. They left as witnesses to the hollowness of those promises, carrying knowledge that was both burden and gift. In the end, what they learned was not about American exceptionalism in any simple nationalist sense. What they witnessed was what happens when industrial capacity, democratic governance, and a population united in purpose combine to address a clear objective. It was not bombs or bullets that most unsettled them, though those were certainly factors. It was abundance married to efficiency. It was the demonstration that a free society, when properly organized, could outproduce and outlast a totalitarian state despite all the supposed advantages of centralized control. The photographs and statistics would survive in archives for historians to study. The production figures would be analyzed and debated and incorporated into military doctrine. But for the women who had lived through those months as prisoners in America, the truth was written not in documents, but in memory. The smell of fresh bread in a prisoner camp, the sound of unlimited communications flowing across telephone lines, the sight of factories operating at a pace that seemed impossible, the taste of real coffee and fresh fruit. All of it added up to a simple conclusion that no amount of propaganda could obscure. They had been told lies about the nature of their enemy and the prospects for their cause. Reality had proven more powerful than ideology, and that lesson once learned could never be entirely forgotten. The irony was sharp and painful. German propaganda had spent years painting America as weak, decadent, divided by democracy and softened by prosperity. What the prisoners discovered instead was a nation that had transformed prosperity into productive capacity, that had unified diverse populations behind a common purpose, that had brought discipline and organization to bear on industrial problems with results that exceeded what centralized authoritarian control had achieved. The very characteristics that were supposed to be weaknesses, freedom and abundance and democratic debate, had proven in practice to be sources of tremendous strength. This was the final and perhaps most important lesson the prisoners carried with them back across the Atlantic. Tyranny had promised them glory and delivered only destruction. Democracy, which they had been taught to despise as chaotic and weak, had produced order and overwhelming force. The world was not as they had been told, and having seen the truth with their own eyes, they could never entirely unsee it, no matter how much easier blindness might have been.